One of the most famous trades in Major League Baseball history happened 41 years ago today, from this video's upload date. On June 13th, 1984, the Chicago Cubs and Cleveland Indians completed a 7-player deal. The Cubs acquired starting pitcher Rick Sutcliffe, reliever George Frazier, and catcher Ron Hassey. The Indians acquired outfielders Joe Carter and Mel Hall, starter Don Schultz, and career minor league pitcher Darryl Banks. The impact this trade had could warrant its own video, but for a very short summary, Rick Sutcliffe, who was struggling with Cleveland, had one of the greatest single-season turnarounds of all time. He went 16-1 with Chicago in 1984, en route to a postseason appearance, and winning the National League Cy Young Award. The Indians' main return, Joe Carter, blossomed into a solid hitter for the team for several years, hitting over 150 home runs and stealing over 125 bases in 6 seasons for the Tribe. He was eventually flipped for 2 players in Sandy Alomar Jr. and Carlos Baerga, who both were key pieces in Cleveland's World Series runs in the 1990s. It's possibly the greatest win-win trade in baseball history, one that lives on fame over 40 years later, and it almost never happened. Sort of. It's not as if a player exercised a no-trade clause, or someone failed a physical. No. This trade almost fell through due to an enormous gaffe committed by one of the general managers. Just to give a little bit of context first, through the first 2.5 months of the 1984 season, the Cubs were one of the best teams in baseball. Thanks to a potent lineup, Chicago jumped out to a 33-25 record through June 12th. Despite the great start, their already thin starting rotation was taking a hit, as 2 starters, Scott Sanderson and Dick Ruthven, got injured at the end of May. Luckily for the Cubs, the Indians were in the complete opposite situation. On June 12th, Cleveland had a record of 22-34, the worst in the American League. With one team looking to buy and one looking to sell, the Cubs and Indians came together and struck the deal. Chicago acquired a much-needed starting pitcher, as well as a couple of other veteran pieces for their run at a division title. Cleveland acquired multiple young players that could pay dividends down the stretch. Seems like a classic, typical deadline deal. So what exactly was the problem? The problem was while the trade was accepted on both sides, the Cubs general manager, Dallas Green, made a little bit of a blunder. Nothing too egregious. All he did was trade 2 players that didn't clear waivers. That might sound a little confusing for some, so if I may explain what that means, there was a rule at the time that for any interleague trade, aka a trade between a National League team and American League team, all players involved had to clear through waivers to be eligible to be traded. All of the players coming from the Indians cleared waivers, but not all of the Cubs players did. Specifically, Mel Hall and Joe Carter. At first, you might be wondering why those 2 didn't clear waivers. Was there a super specific reason why they didn't? Maybe some kind of unforeseen loophole? Nope. Mel Hall and Joe Carter didn't clear waivers because Dallas Green forgot to put them on waivers. Yes, you heard that right. As one anonymous baseball executive put it, I keep that information with me at all times. Who I've gotten waivers on, who I need them for. Doing what Dallas did is unbelievable. It's like forgetting your wallet. This wasn't some minor oversight that could have happened to anyone. This was a mistake that should have never happened in the first place. So what, you might be saying? Doesn't that mean the trade gets voided and both teams rework it? Well, it wasn't that simple. Since the trade was accepted by both teams, the Cubs were allowed to add the players they acquired to their roster and play them. However, the Indians were not allowed to add Mel Hall or Joe Carter to their roster. Once Green realized his mistake, he did put Hall and Carter on waivers, but both were still on the Cubs roster until the waiver period ended. I would like to repeat all of that because it sounds vaguely important. The Cubs were allowed to add Sutcliffe, Frazier, and Massey to the roster and use them in the games immediately. At the same time though, Mel Hall and Joe Carter were still on the Cubs roster as they had to pass through waivers in order to be added to the Indians roster. Maybe it's just me, but is this not the dumbest thing ever to happen from a trade? First off, how on earth could Dallas Green not know those two players didn't pass through waivers? The waiver rule for interleague trades wasn't something new or rare. Green absolutely knew about it. How do I know that? The fact that he made an interleague trade just a few weeks prior. In May of 1984, the Cubs made a trade with the American League Boston Red Sox. Chicago sent first baseman Bill Buckner for pitcher Dennis Eckersley. Clearly, Green was aware of the waiver rule. It also wasn't as if the waiver deadline snuck up on Green. The deadline to put players on waivers began on May 2nd, 6 weeks before the trade. Additionally, Dallas Green actually did put those two players on waivers the previous season, but those waivers expired on May 1st, so he was supposed to put them on waivers again. Somehow, all of that must have just slipped his mind. What exactly did Green say about this whole ordeal? I effed up. I just made a mistake. I might as well take the heat for it. It was our error, our mistake. Cleveland didn't do anything wrong. It was us. We didn't know about the technicalities in the waiver rule at the time we announced the deal. Didn't know the technicalities of the rule. I beg your pardon, Dallas Green? It is quite legitimately your job to know that. I might add that Green was not a newly hired general manager. If he was recently hired, maybe I could see it as a rookie mistake, but 1984 was his fourth season as the Cubs general manager. He was a veteran GM at this point, but forgot to do this crucial thing. The gaffe received mixed results from those in the league. Indians manager Pat Corrales was furious with what happened, as he said, "When I heard, I couldn't believe it." Cleveland general manager Phil Segui was not happy either, as he said, "I was flabbergasted. I got screwed because Dallas Green messed up. We did our part. The thing is, we're clean on this matter, and we're getting the short end of the stick. The first thing you do is ask the other general manager if he has his waivers on the players you want. Dallas said he did, so we did everything right and got the short end of the stick." On the other hand, Indian scout Bertie Tebbetts wasn't upset, as he said, "It's no big deal. We're very happy." Odd thing to say, but I digress. Now, we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. It's one thing if all the Indians had to do was wait a few days to get Hall and Carter, but it wasn't as simple as just waiting. Since the two players had to pass waivers, what would happen in the event that another team put a claim on them? If a team did put a claim, either that player goes to the new team or returns to the Cubs. Hold on, couldn't the Indians put a claim on both players? Seems like that would be a loophole to get around this. That could work in theory, if not for one small problem. Since this was an interleague trade, the only teams that could claim the players were teams within the same league. The Cubs are in the National League, and last time I checked, the Indians played in the American League. Now you fully understand the large degree of this gaffe. Imagine trading away multiple league caliber players, but the prospects you were supposed to receive end up on another team. In a hypothetical situation, a competing National League East team could assess the situation and disrupt the trade by claiming either Mel Hall or Joe Carter. In that scenario, one of a few things would happen. A. The Cubs cancel the waivers, retain Hall and Carter, and trade them to the Indians in the offseason. B. The Cubs would either have to substitute players, or C. Additional players would have to be added. Green remained optimistic about the outcome and said the worst case scenario would be either substituting or adding players to the deal. However, I think there's a secret fourth outcome that was blindsided. there was at least a non-zero chance the trade would eventually get nixed, and both sides would retain their original players. Sure, Dallas Green said he was positive he wouldn't lose the 3 players the Cubs received, but of course he's going to say that. Imagine the heat he would take if he had to tell the Cubs and Cubs fans the players they just received had to be returned. The league absolutely had the power to veto this, and I'm honestly surprised they didn't step in during this period to do something. If the Cubs were allowed to get away with trading ineligible players, what's stopping another team in the future from doing so as well? There was at least one person who agreed, as Henry Hecht of Sports Illustrated said the commissioner should block the deal in the best interest of baseball. Of course, it never came to that. How much more fortunate could Dallas Green get, as a week following the trade, both Mel Hall and Joe Carter did indeed pass through waivers, finally completing the trade between the Cubs and the Indians. In hindsight, I can see why a competing National League East team didn't put a claim for either player. If a team did, the Cubs could theoretically play the rest of the 1984 season with Hall and Carter, as well as the trio they received from Cleveland. That scenario might hurt Chicago in the long run, but absolutely help them in the short run. In the end, everything worked out on both sides. Rick Sutcliffe went to Chicago, won the Cy Young Award, and guided the Cubs to their first playoff appearance since World War II. Joe Carter was a fantastic part of the lineup for the Indians, and was later flipped for World Series pieces. All of that may never have happened thanks to the enormous mistake made by the Chicago general manager, Dallas Green.